I'm Lil.
And I'm Fitz.
And you're listening to Knock Once for Yes.
Welcome to a somewhat belated episode of Knock Once for Yes. We are really sorry that it's late, and we want to thank all of you for being so patient with us, especially our patrons who have more of a right than anyone to be annoyed that the episode is late. For those of you that don't follow us on social media, we've had a very difficult time recently with our kitty family. We lost one, another needs twice daily injections, and a third needs near constant supervision at the moment. It has been physically, emotionally, and financially draining. So we would like to thank all of you for being so patient, for your kind words and support, and I'd like to say a special thank you to my mum who's been helping us out with the vet's bills, as I honestly don't know what we would have done without her help. With everything that's been going on, we have had to change the plan for the next couple of episodes. We were going to have a Ouija board special this time, but we've had a couple more ideas on this and decided to defer this now until our October episode. Thank you to everyone that sent in their Ouija stories. They are coming, we promise.
And with that in mind, if anybody else does have a Ouija board story that they'd be willing to share, please do keep them coming in. But for now, on with today's show. And Fitz, what have we got coming up on this episode?
Today, we're going to hear the second part of Lil's adventures in haunted Colchester. We have another creepy doll story on the Paranormal Radar, and we have listener stories from Lulu, BerriBlue and Jei. We've also had some interesting emails and messages from you this month. Vanna got in touch to let us know that she listens to a lot of podcasts at work, but it's only when she's listening to us that the lights flicker on and off and her phone cuts out.
That's really strange.
I do seem to remember that another one of our listeners had some spooky stuff happen when she listened to the show as well. Do you think we can somehow spread the spooky through the internet?
That would be pretty cool.
You might also remember a few episodes ago when we talked about Zach Bagans from Ghost Adventures buying the mirror once owned by the captain of the Titanic, and in which his apparition was said to appear. That was the captain of the Titanic, not Zach Bagans appearing in the mirror, just in case. Maxie got in touch to let us know that the mirror is now on display at Zach's Haunted Museum in Las Vegas, and that it even has its own room, decked out to look like the inside of a ship. Thanks for letting us know, Maxie, and hopefully we'll get a chance to go have a look for ourselves one day.
Wasn't there an anniversary ghost associated with that mirror? I'm sure there was an anniversary ghost, so it makes me wonder if they've got a special setup in his museum. Perhaps they'll do something to investigate the mirror on that date.
I can't remember offhand, but you may be right, so if we do ever visit, we'll have to look it up and make sure that we go on that date.
Exactly, that's what I'm thinking.
Before we get to our spooky doll Paranormal Radar story today, we'd like to thank our latest patrons. It's been another amazing month, and we have nearly reached our next Patreon goal already. We say it every time, but we really do appreciate all of you that support the show through Patreon and Ko-fi. Not only could we literally not continue to create the show without you, but your support really does give us a massive boost, especially when we're having a difficult time. And if you keep it up at this rate, being able to work on the podcast full-time is looking a little more realistic. And so, we'd like to thank our latest patrons.
Becky Escotto,
Karen Garner,
Kaylee Williams,
Megan,
BerriBlue,
Juliana McAlpin,
Sierra Cersei,
Selena,
Carla Miller,
Dylan Gladstone,
Mira Loves Fandom,
Mary,
and we'd also like to thank some of our patrons who upped their pledges this month. Julie Fuller,
Zamira Gibb,
and Tracy Henley.
And we'd also like to thank Siobhan,
Katie,
and Nikki for making donations through Ko-fi.
Guys, we've absolutely been blown away by your support this month. It means so much to us, and like Fitz just said, we have been having a rough time, and it's not just the financial support, it's just knowing that you guys are backing us has given us such a lift at a difficult time. Thank you, genuinely.
And now it's time for our Paranormal Radar story, which takes us all the way to New Zealand, where a 200-year-old doll was stolen from the Waipu Museum in Auckland. The doll is pretty creepy, and as usual, we'll put a link to the story in the show notes on the website so you can have a look for yourselves. But it certainly isn't something that I'd really want in my house. It was, though, valued at around $3,000, which presumably was what spurred the thief into action. Following the theft, the museum took to social media in an attempt to locate the doll, and commenters mentioned that they believed the doll was haunted, and they expected that the thief may well have gotten more than they bargained for. Perhaps the commenters had it right, and the doll was haunting the thief. Perhaps they were overcome with guilt, or maybe they just struggled to offload it with the theft being publicised. Whatever the reason, the doll was returned 2 days later, wrapped in a plastic bread bag, with a damaged leg and arm wrapped in duct tape, and its scalp missing.
Its scalp missing?
Yes.
This doll turned up wrapped in a bread bag having been scalped.
Yeah, they did find some of its hair on the floor when it went missing, so there's a suspicion that it was damaged in the theft with the scalp.
Oh, like they pulled it out by the hair or something?
Possibly something like that, but they'd obviously tried to repair it with duct tape. Now the thing is, you steal an expensive doll and you think, oh, this is worth some money, I can sell that. Why do you then try and repair it with duct tape?
Well, yeah, I mean, my first thought is, well, actually, I've got to be honest, my first thought is, haha, they got their comeuppance, because when people go around stealing valuable antiques and damaging heritage property, I have to internally laugh a little bit when they get haunted as a result. Because just don't do that stuff, guys. Don't do it.
No, I get the impression that that is what happened here, because if you're a thief, even if you can't get rid of something, you don't think, oh, I'll give it back then.
No, exactly. Even if you can't offload it. And I mean, what are the chances that you would? It's obviously something of a lot of value, something very unique, something people are going to be able to recognise. I can't imagine how they thought they were going to offload it anyway, to be honest. But even if you can't, the last thing you're going to do is go post it back into through the museum's door, surely.
And it is terrifying. Even when it was intact, it looked pretty darn terrifying. I mean, definitely go have a look at this doll, because dolls are bad enough, but this is a creepy doll.
All dolls are creepy to me. You know me. We'll hear more about that later as it happens. But yeah, you've got to imagine that something a bit weird went on there for them to post it back.
Yeah, it reminds me of when people steal stones from haunted places and that. I get that vibe from it.
Yeah, and we've come across a lot of these now, actually, haven't we? When people have taken stones from a site, or I think this is the first sort of full-out theft of a valuable object like that. But yeah, it sounds like that doll wanted to go back to that museum.
Indeed. We're going to jump into some listener stories now, and all the stories on this episode have been recorded by our listeners themselves, which I particularly love, as I get to be a coffee listener.
No, that is a good point. I do enjoy that too. It is sometimes just really nice to sit back and be read a good ghost story.
Love it.
Well, this first one is from Lulu.
Hello, Fitz and Lil. My name is Louisa, and I live in New York City, and I just wanted to share one of my paranormal experiences with you. I lived in Colombia for the first 11 years of my life, and this particular story takes place there. I was 4 years old. I lived in a small 3-bedroom house with my mother and my sister. I had my own room, which was nice during the day when I could play to my heart's content without bothering anyone, but at night it was a little different. I've been afraid of the dark ever since I can remember. I'm 31 and I still have to use a nightlight sometimes, because sometimes at times it has felt like there was someone watching me or something. It doesn't happen every night. It doesn't happen every day. But throughout my life, I have felt like I'm not alone, even when I'm alone in a room. Like I feel a presence, which is very common, I think. But I think that's what kind of made me afraid of the dark, because it would happen in my room at night. And so I can recall many nights in which I cried at bedtime, hoping my mom would let me sleep with her. And sometimes she did, but most of the time she wanted me to stay in my room because she wanted me to be independent, which is understandable. So this particular night, I had gone to bed without complaint. After what I guess had been a couple of hours of sleep, I opened my eyes suddenly. All of a sudden, I remember just my eyes flying open. I was lying on my back, and what I saw will never, ever, ever leave my memory. My twin bed faced the one window in my small room, so there was a little moonlight to see by. And what I saw was a man standing over my bed. He wore a plaid shirt in red tones and dark blue jeans. He was thin. He had remarkably thick and shiny hair in the hairstyle of like 1950s greasers. Just very shiny, very thick, and in that kind of hairstyle. And however, what terrified me the most was his face. It looked rotten. I still remember the sickly kind of bluish gray hue and the scabs that covered parts of his face. It was as if he'd been dead underwater, like rotting underwater. He had dark, shining eyes and long, thick eyelashes. And I can see him in my mind right now. I can see it. It was really scary. I was frozen, unable to process what was happening. I felt cold but sweaty and my teeth were clenched painfully. And then that man smiled. But it was the smile of a predator. He looked at me like he had found just what he was looking for, and his teeth were very large and very white. And this smile sent a jolt of fear through me. I'm getting goosebumps talking about it now. I shut my eyes tightly and moved toward the light switch, which was next to my bed. And I turned on the light, and when I opened my eyes, he or it, whatever it was gone. So I yelled for my mother, and I told her what happened as best as I could as a very, very scared 4-year-old. And of course, her first reaction was to say that it was probably a nightmare. And I guess I can't really ever deny or confirm this, but it felt very real, and it felt like I had woken up and like it happened while I was waking. My mother has also had various supernatural experiences, so it is possible that she just wanted to kind of protect me from the knowledge that some sort of malevolent, scary entity came so close to me. So that would make sense. I haven't spoken to her about this since I was a child, so I'd be curious to know what she would say now that I'm an adult. So maybe I'll do that and get back to you guys. But it was just terrifying, and it's one of my first memories. Thankfully, I never saw that man again, but there have been other experiences that I've had, and so I will definitely be sharing those in the future.
Thank you, Louisa, for getting in touch and sharing that story. I found it really fascinating. You do hear a lot about these stories where people wake up and there's somebody leaning over the bed, but the vast majority of those stories, there doesn't seem to be anywhere near as much detail as you provided.
No, that was one thing I was going to say. Firstly, I have had the experience of seeing a man leaning over my bed, and I knew he was looking at me, but there was nowhere near that level of detail. I mean, it sounds like it's really burned into your memory, well, with good reason. I mean, something like that would make a massive impact. I also want to say I totally get you about the nightlight. Fitz will attest. I had to have a nightlight until we moved into this house, and for some time afterwards. When we first moved into this house, there was no paranormal activity here for quite some time, but despite that, having come from many houses that did have activity, I had to sleep with the nightlight on for a long, long time.
We're almost entirely opposite in that, because I quite like a little bit of noise when I'm going to sleep, whether it's a quiet radio or I can fall asleep in front of the television very easily, but I struggle if it's bright. Whereas Lil's the other way around. She can sleep in broad daylight, but a tiny bit of noise and that's it. She can't sleep. So,
but you equally, I imagine you like that bit of noise to cover up any spooky noises that might be happening.
I'm not sure why I like it, to be honest. I just kind of find it relaxing and comforting. Just that sort of the human connection. I find it easier to sleep during the day as well, oddly. I like the fact that the world is going on around me outside.
And I just wondered if it was because we'd lived in houses where there were odd, unexplained, mysterious, spooky noises at night, whether it was kind of a comfort thing to have that kind of noise in the background that might cover up anything like that.
Quite possibly not necessarily cover up. I think in daytime it's a lot easier to go, that thump must have been the neighbours or somebody walking their dog, or when it's 3 o'clock in the morning,
that's a lot more difficult to explain.
It's like, who the hell would be up doing this at this time of night, sort of things. And it's like, oh God, what was that? That made me jump. And it's so quiet. Whereas during the day, you've got all the background noise that sort of covers everything up. So
the other thing I wanted to mention, with regards to what you said about your mum, and you thinking perhaps she just said it was a nightmare to kind of comfort you. And I had a very similar experience with that as well. One of my childhood homes that I lived in, I didn't actually ever see anything in this particular home, but I was convinced it was haunted. And at the time, I couldn't explain why. I was just too young. I'm guessing I was picking up on some kind of a spooky vibe, but I couldn't articulate that. But I did tell my mum a lot of times in that house that I was convinced it was haunted and there was a ghost there. But again, the same as you experienced, she brushed it off. She said no. She hadn't experienced anything there. However, many years later, I found out that she actually had a lot of experiences in that house, but she didn't want to scare us by confirming, our fear, especially as I hadn't seen anything. I can understand it. I guess with you, it's a bit different because you really did experience something, whereas I didn't. But I can understand that she was just sort of trying not to confirm my fears, I guess. But yeah, I did find out years later that actually she experienced quite a lot of paranormal activity in that house.
Yes, I'm sorry your first experience was such a creepy one, but it does sound like you've had a few more, so we'd definitely be interested to hear more about that. And you've given me an idea for some new coffee merch. I think a new coffee nightlight might be the way forward.
I would buy that.
Well, thank you again to Lulu for sharing that story. And I think it's time now to move on to our second listener story, and this one is from BerriBlue.
The story isn't particularly exciting or spooky, but it is very significant for me as it represents a turning point. It's an example of a clear and partially corroborated observation of a minor premonition. Here's a little background for context. I was raised Catholic, but I quickly saw through all that. And in the process of rejecting the church, I also rejected anything in the slightest supernatural or superstitious, in a sense, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It took a long time for me to come around from that hardline atheist stance to a less dogmatic one, and separate church from spirituality, arriving at my current position of skeptically curious agnosticism. I'd never personally had a supernatural experience, although members of my family do have the usual stories that I suppose every family must share. My wife, on the other hand, was raised in a secular family. Religion simply wasn't a feature of her family life, and so there wasn't anything to rebel against. There are many stories from her childhood that, in hindsight, match very closely with typical poltergeist, haunting, and time slip stories. At the time, she just thought of them as weird things that happened. She just didn't read into them much, I suppose. One thing that has always been important to Berry is dreaming. She and her mother are both very strong dreamers, and have on occasion shared the same dream, or experienced some form of premonition or mental connection. As you can imagine, when we got together, I didn't put much store into them, brushing them off as coincidence or fancifully stretching the abstract vagaries of dreamscape to match whatever happened afterwards. However, discussing dreams in the morning over a cup of tea was still an important ritual for us. I didn't think there was anything supernatural about them, but, especially since Berry was going through a lot of mental health difficulty, they were invaluable in terms of psychoanalysis. I was also, and still am, fiercely jealous of her, as I almost never remember my dreams. There have been many uncanny predictions and seemingly impossible connections I brushed off before one finally constituted, to me at least, undeniable proof of some form of precognition going on in Berry's dreams. We were living in rural Portugal at the time, and Berry was, as usual, telling me about her dreams one morning. She described being on the London Underground, but it wasn't underground, and looking out of the window. There was a lot of water around, like canals and big modern buildings. Her dreams are largely visual, so it was quite descriptive, though we only wrote down the basic details, so the full picture is lost to the fog of forgetfulness, really. The narrative parts skip to and fro as dream plots tend to, but culminated in an attempted terrorist attack on the tube. There was a bomb and a moment of panic, but everything was all right in the end and the attack never really happened. And that was it. One dream amongst many, which was consigned to the pages of one diary amongst many, and forgotten about. A month or so afterwards, due to completely unpredictable circumstances, including a death in the family and unforeseeable financial issues, we ended up leaving Portugal and going to live in England for a while. Neither of us had lived in the UK before, and we'd be staying in my late aunt's house. We arrived in December and spent Christmas with my grandparents. On the 31st, Berry, my cousin Max and I all decided to go into London to a New Year's Eve party. We took the train into Lewisham and then changed to DLR line. After a couple of stops, Berry started to get a little uneasy and mentioned that this looked very familiar. She'd definitely been on this line before. Neither of us, of course, had. The DLR, for those unfamiliar, is the Docklands Light Rail, a part of the London Underground network. It's mostly overground and goes through an area full of modern buildings, docks and canals. Berry brought up the dream she'd had back in Portugal, and I realised that the surroundings were very much as she'd described. Max and I made fun of her a little and had a laugh. I asked her if we'd won the lottery in her dream, maybe we should buy some tickets. No, she said. There was a bomb when we went underground. Now, it didn't so much cause us any concern, but it did deflate our fun a little, so we brushed it off and continued talking about our plans for the night. Berry silently got increasingly uneasy, particularly as we neared Bank Station and the train went down into the underground proper. As we pulled up to the platform, the train's tannoy came on and the driver made an announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid we must ask you to evacuate the station, as a suspicious package has been reported. Judging by the exasperated but largely apathetic reactions of the other passengers, I'd say this sort of thing happens from time to time, and people made for the exits in a calm and orderly manner. Max, Berry and I bolted out for dear life. Not so much panic as an at-all-cost, no-nonsense action mode. We emerged back into daylight, all full of adrenaline, and had a nervous laugh about the uncanniness of Berry's prediction, and then more or less forgot about it. Since we'd had to get out a few stops early, we now had a long hike into town, and parties and celebrations to be getting on with. It wasn't until a day or two later that the significance of it became really clear to me. Berry had a dream. It was reported to me and written down, both events that I can corroborate and placed at a particular date. Then, afterwards, the sense of déjà vu was reported to me and Max, another impartial observer, who can both corroborate the reporting of a specific action, which played out after the report, so it wasn't a mix-up or something that was misremembered due to stress or panic or anything else. And then, on consulting the written record, the detail about the whole thing being a false alarm, which we'd forgotten about, was seen to match even more exactly with what we observed. From that point on, I started to put a lot more weight on potentially supernatural explanations for bizarre occurrences. And we have, on more than one occasion, made some important decisions because of a hint, feeling, or another message from a dream, in all significant cases, leading to the best possible outcome in the situation concerned. What really strikes me about the whole event was the mundanity of the prediction. It wasn't the sinking of the Titanic. It didn't even especially have an impact on us, albeit a little scary. I do believe that most coincidences are coincidences, and we must absolutely write off any weird, bizarre cases where there's no evidence or the claim can be reasonably explained. But I do now feel that we've lost the magic in everyday life. The more we learn about the quantum world and the true nature of reality, my thoughts on which I won't go into detail here at the behest of my wife, the more we can draw parallels in the logic to the way we observe the supernatural world to work. To end on a wonderfully corny and potentially discrediting line, magic seems to be all around. Not great and spectacular, but so ordinary that we simply don't see it.
Now, the canny-eared amongst you may have noticed that it was actually BerriBlue's husband Willem that read that story. So thank you to Willem and BerriBlue for getting in touch and sharing that absolutely fascinating story.
Yep.
I really, really enjoyed that. And like you say, there's a lot of these things where people have these premonitions and they're either a bit vague or they don't really mention it to anybody before the event.
Well, it's not just premonitions. I mean, he is so right. It is absolutely rare to get an example like this where there's a written record of it happening. You've got people to corroborate it when the event comes to unfold. So many times, with even with our own ghost stories, you know, that we didn't write them down after they happened, and you do wonder in your own mind as you're retelling them, am I remembering this accurately? Am I reading things into it after the fact because of, you know, other things that have happened since then that have sort of tainted my memory somehow? But But this is a fantastic example. It was set in stone the minute you wrote it down that first time.
Yeah, there's such an amazing amount of detail that it was an underground, but it wasn't underground. And there was the bomb threat. It wasn't just like, oh, I was on a train and something happened. It was all a bit
so specific.
It was very specific over exactly what had gone on. And especially, not only did you not live in London at the time, but I think you said you'd never even been. So it's not as if it's something really familiar to you that happens every day, and that, of course you dream about that because you do it all the time. It was something that was out of your experience, and they are having this premonition about it. It's amazing. I did actually chat back and forth with Willem and BerriBlue for a little bit about this because I found it so interesting. And she'd had, this wasn't the only experience that she'd had doing this. And as Willem said during the story, there was a few times when they've made quite major life decisions on it and it's turned out well for them. It's really, really interesting.
I think it's really interesting what Willem was saying about throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And you're not alone. I think it's really easy to take everything weird and strange and unexplained and supernatural and lump it in with religion and anything to do with that kind of, your beliefs and religious systems. I don't think they have to be the same thing at all. I think they can be completely separate, and you can have beliefs about religion, but you can also see the weird and the unexplained and the everyday magic that happens all around you, and they don't have to intersect as far as I'm concerned.
And if you really want to stick with a sort of skeptical mind view, then you could just consider it your subconscious is pulling sort of information from the news, and there's been recent bombings in London, blah blah blah, and sort of tying things together for you. If you really want to avoid the spooky weirdness.
But I do think there's a lot to be said about tuning into your intuition. I think there's a lot we don't understand about our intuition and what we can do with it and what we're capable of. And I think it's really easy to write it all off as just woo.
Yeah, I think there is a little more, even with my skeptical hat on, I think there is a little bit more to it than a lot of people give it credit. And I think everybody has gut feelings. But there are times when things seem to really slap you in the face.
Yeah, definitely.
I think my prime example, we've spoken about it briefly before, is when Lil and I went on our first date. And we were sat in the car afterwards, and I wasn't quite sure how to, leave. And this voice in my head, in Gandalf's voice from Lord of the Rings, just went, "Kiss her, you fool!" And it literally, I heard the voice in my head. It wasn't like it wasn't just a gut feeling. This was, I don't know whether it was my subconscious or fate or what, but something in my head just went, "Do something, you idiot!" Which
is funny as a story on its own. However, I heard the exact same thing in Gandalf's voice. I mean, why?
I'm fairly certain that Gandalf wasn't passing the car at the time.
No, it wasn't. It was just the two of us. And as funny and ridiculous as that story sounds, it is all true. We both heard in our heads at exactly the same time, the same words in the same film star voice. For whatever reason. And as ridiculous as that sounds, it does make you wonder why. And I think it really hit home what Willem said about the everyday magic. And I think that is a really good example. It's something that if we hadn't compared notes, you wouldn't think anything about it. But having spoken to each other afterwards, that it's such a bizarre thing to happen. And I think there is stuff like this that goes on all around us if you just notice it.
It was weird. It was almost the frustration in the voice as well. I mean, now that we're together, we talked about our pasts and things like that, and we've always crossed paths. Like it's a bit like sliding doors. We've been so close throughout our lives and never really met.
It was like somebody got really frustrated with us and like, now, for goodness sake,
like, I've been trying to put this together for years. No, don't mess this up.
But yeah, to get back to our point, I do think actually there's a lot more to intuition, and I do think we shouldn't just write it off as being woo or being fluffy. I think you can look at it even with a skeptic hat on, and realise that perhaps there is a lot more going on there than we just currently understand.
Yes, and I was rather taken with the description of everyday magic. I think I shall use that myself going forwards. BerriBlue is also a rather talented artist. What we'll do is we'll put some links in the show notes to her website and gallery if you want to check out some of her artwork, although do be warned, some of it is not safe for work.
And that brings us to our next story, and this one's from Jei. And just a quick heads up that this story does contain a description of an injury requiring emergency medical treatment.
So if you find those topics uncomfortable, please just skip forward 5 minutes and that should take you to the end of the story.
Hello, my name is Jei, hailing from Toronto, Ontario, Canada. This following story also occurred in Toronto. When I was 6, my mother was temporarily separated from my stepfather. My 2-year-old brother and I moved in with her into an older home in an Italian neighborhood. We rented the top floor of a small, detached 2-story house. In order to enter our second-floor apartment, we would unlock the front door, access the shared foyer, go up the stairs, and unlock a secondary door that led into our area. The landlords were an older couple, very quiet, reclusive, odd. As strange as they were, my mother shrugged it off. It's not like we had to associate with them that much. But because she had 2 small children, she installed both a deadbolt and a chain, just to be safe. Our living space was quite small, and the bedroom only could fit a twin mattress and my brother's toddler bed. I wound up on the pull-out sofa in the living room at the opposite end of the apartment. I didn't mind. We had a large, beautiful bay window in that room, and I loved looking towards the sky as I drifted off to sleep. We lived in that house for approximately a year. During that time, my mother grew more and more convinced there was something wrong with the place. Strange noises at night, lights turning on and off, all the classic tropes. One of which was my sudden onset of violent nightmares. First, my mother thought it was due to one too many secreted ghost books read under the covers at night. I was a precocious young reader. Or perhaps a lax babysitter that allowed me to watch one scary movie too many. There were a few that did. Then one night, I woke up with a start and began vomiting large amounts of blood. My mom rushed me to the ER where they discovered I had somehow sliced open the lining of my trachea, and I needed to have that cauterized as soon as possible. I've never forgotten the horror of being strapped to that gurney as a medical team stuck silver nitrate sticks down my throat to burn the sensitive lining together, stopping the bleed. I couldn't receive any numbing agent or sedation due to where the damage was located. I was lucky enough to feel everything. Traumatizing. The doctor wasn't sure what caused the rupture, or maybe he did have a theory, but my mom has denied he gave one. As far as my mother was concerned, this was a bad omen. Ultimately, what pushed my mom over was what happened the following week. It was a hot summer night. We live by a lake, so summers can be incredibly, horrifically humid. And with no air conditioner available, the whirring blades of the fan gave very little relief. Mom was awoken that night to the sound of heavy, steady footsteps going up the stairs to the second-floor apartment. This was disconcerting for my mother because it was the middle of the night. She couldn't place whose footsteps she was hearing. Regardless, she expected them to stop once they reached our heavily locked door. Instead, without a pause, the steps continued right into our apartment and took a sharp left into the living room where I was sleeping. My mom felt like she couldn't move. She tried to get up, to call out, but for some reason was unable to do anything. She claims the whole apartment went silent for what felt like hours. In reality, it may have only been 10 minutes. Suddenly, the footsteps started again. This time, the steps were heading towards the kitchen, on the other end of the apartment. In order to get there, whoever was there would have to pass by the open door of my mother's room. She had a perfect view into the hallway. Yet when the steps passed her door, no one was there. The steps continued forward without slowing and eventually faded away. As soon as the sound had ceased, my mother was able to move again. She jumped out of bed and ran to me to see if I was okay. I was still asleep, but freezing cold to the touch. I remember my mother shaking me awake in a panic, repeatedly saying, "We need to leave." That night, she packed a small bag of essentials and took my brother and I to one of her friend's house. We crashed on her basement floor for a few weeks until we found another place to live. I never stepped foot back into that house. My mom went back only once. She came to pack up our clothes in small pieces. She arranged for the furniture to be donated and had been ready to battle with the landlords about breaking their lease. Instead, she found that they didn't put up any fight. No anger, no confusion, no questions. Since then, I've had odd things happen to me and seen people and things others claim they don't. Admittedly, I'm still quite skeptical of everything, including things I thought I saw, heard, experienced. I constantly assume I'm just sleep deprived and overworked. While I might be a skeptic, my mother steadfastly insists I'm far more sensitive to the spiritual world, and she is still traumatized about that supposed midnight visit years ago.
And thank you so much to Jei for sharing that story with us. Now, I don't know about you, but one of the things that I really picked up on from that story was the footsteps, because I know that you and I have both heard disembodied footsteps or unexplained footsteps, and that can be so terrifying or in and of itself. And I'm talking about just when you maybe hear footsteps go across the landing and you're thinking there shouldn't be anybody there. But in this case, they actually went into the apartment with them.
Yeah, I mean, this was the thing, when you first hear it, it's like, and they went up to the stairs, and the mother was expecting them to stop at the front door, but they just carried straight on through.
Yeah, and that must be, I'd be frozen in fear.
Yeah, especially, if it's late at night and you think someone's basically just breaking into your apartment and you can't move.
Yeah.
That's so terrifying. But it also makes me wonder again whether this is another one of those time slip things, because obviously the door didn't give it any pause whatsoever, just straight through, and it didn't seem to... Yeah, there was no description of it really doing anything.
There's no
other
interaction
than walking around.
there
was no interaction,
Yeah.
So as to whether it was just present but not present, if you see what I mean, it was...
No, I do. And I mean, I've often wondered that about footsteps, so the disembodied footstep phenomena in general. Because it does seem to fit more into like a repeating type haunt, the stone tape theory, something just happening over and over again, one moment in time that's just sort of frozen and playing on a loop. And that does sound like it could just be somebody coming home, and that's such a well-worn routine that it just continues to sort of play in the ether, as it were.
Yeah, but that doesn't then seem to tie into Jay's mum being frozen.
No,
and
I would agree.
paralysed.
And it did seem there was an overarching sense of something a bit darker there.
Yeah, and the fact that Jay was freezing cold as well. I don't think she said she woke up, but her mum checked on her and she was freezing. So there was obviously some kind of effect there. And also the fact that her mum bundled them out of the house and they never went back. That makes me wonder whether something else happened there that Jay wasn't aware of.
Well, the other thing I was thinking is that they didn't seem to have any trouble from the landlord in the fact that they left so quickly. So that would definitely lead me to believe that other tenants there had had similar experiences, almost like something in the apartment didn't want other people in what maybe the entity was thinking was their apartment.
Yeah, I kind of read between the lines on that one as well.
Yeah, it sounds... I really hesitate to sort of label... Well, as you know, I very much hesitate to label things as dark, but I could definitely wonder whether something was being protective of their space, if nothing else, at the very least.
Yeah, there certainly seemed to be a little bit more there than was said. Like, we've had sort of footsteps and stuff going on in our house, and I think it wouldn't be enough to drive me to move on its own.
No, but some buildings you can go into and there is just this atmosphere.
Yeah.
And it's not something you can really explain or sort of pinpoint. And, on the one hand, I'm saying I don't like to label things as dark, but, by the same token, to completely contradict myself, I have been into buildings where you just walk in and think, whoa, there is something not right here.
Yeah, true. I can concur. I've been in buildings like that before as well. And I think with Jay's mum saying to her that she felt like Jay had more of a sort of sensitivity, I wonder whether that meant she does as well.
Possibly.
But yeah, it certainly sounds like you've had some more experiences there as well, Jay. I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about the things you're seeing that other people aren't.
Definitely.
So thank you again to Jei for sharing that story, and thank you to everyone that shared stories with us this episode.
And thank you to all our listeners for reading their own stories and doing the work for us. It's an absolute pleasure when we get to hear stories read to us. We love it. Thank you so much.
And if you've got a story that you'd like to share, don't worry, you don't need to record it yourself, no matter how we say we love hearing them.
We love reading them as well.
So if you've got a story, please do share it with us. Just visit our website, knockOnceForYes.com, and there's a contact form on there that tells you how you can submit your story to us.
But now it's time to settle in with a cuppa and get comfy as we bring you part 2 of our paranormal postcard from Colchester. And we pick up around the time we left off last episode, in the 17th century, as we visit another pub and encounter the dread Witchfinder General once more. And just so you know, there are a handful of grisly deaths in this one. Now, you might expect that the vengeful spirits of those accused by the abhorrent Matthew Hopkins would be practically bursting out of Colchester Castle dungeons. But in fact, the only such documented apparition I could find haunts not the castle, but the local hostelry, and she seems far more intent on wreaking mischief than vengeance.
Legend tells of a series of tunnels that run underneath Colchester, connecting various buildings such as the castle, the town hall, and the Fox and Fiddler pub. The idea of this labyrinth of tunnels instantly conjures up images of secret and maybe nefarious goings-on under the town, further fueled, no doubt, by the rumour that the Fox and Fiddler was the local watering hole of Colchester's highwaymen. And as if that wasn't dastardly enough company to be keeping, in the mid-1640s, Hopkins, the self-titled Witchfinder General, stopped by, looking for a chambermaid by the name of Sarah on suspicion of witchcraft. Sarah sensibly hid, but eventually her hiding place was discovered and Hopkins dragged the poor girl down into the pub cellars. The story goes that from here, he took her into the tunnels under Colchester and, in a disused passageway, Hopkins chained Sarah to the wall and bricked up the passage, leaving her forever entombed within. Now, there's no evidence that I could find that Hopkins randomly went rogue, well, more rogue than his regular rogue, on this one girl, and no explanation as to why he wouldn't have locked her up to await trial with the other accused. In fact, historians dispute the fact that there's even a network of tunnels under Colchester at all, although one local man swore that he was indeed taken down to just such tunnels to shelter from an air raid in World War II, so maybe there is some truth to the tale after all. But one thing seems clear. However the young chambermaid died, she does still seem to be haunting the Fox and Fiddler, and apparently she's quite the character. In an article by the BBC in 2014, the then current pub owners disclosed that she enjoyed playing pranks, and didn't like anything being moved around in the attic, as this used to be her room. As well as making herself known by playing tricks, Sarah has also appeared to staff, who have been able to give detailed descriptions of her as wearing a white pinafore and black dress, with a lace cap over her long blonde hair. It seems though that the owners have made their peace with her presence, and staff and spirit coexist quite happily, although Sarah is perfectly capable of expressing her displeasure when the mood takes her. She apparently got upset when the owners went away and left a friend to mind the bar in their place. She wasn't at all impressed and let her feelings be known by pushing glasses off the bar and smashing them on the floor.
For our lunchtime picnic, we'd walked away from the castle, down to a pretty riverside bank, where we enjoyed the local wildlife for a bit, and the local wildlife enjoyed our sandwiches. But fed and watered, we took our walking tour towards the centre of Colchester once more, which meant making a long trudge back up the hill in the blazing sunshine. It certainly made us appreciate how well placed for defence the castle was. As the hill began to level off, we came upon Colchester's High Street and the next stop on our haunted tour. Another black-beamed and whitewashed building, the Red Lion Hotel is an impressive 15th century inn, with no less than 3 resident ghosts. The Grade 1 listed building still has many of its Tudor features and, according to the hotel website, boasts the accolade of being the 2nd oldest hostelry in England. Even some of the original wattle and daub walls can be seen under glass panels by hotel guests, although not being guests ourselves, we unfortunately didn't enjoy that privilege. But not to worry, as some of the most interesting history can be found just outside of the hotel, in Red Lion Yard. The entrance to the hotel is not actually at the front of the building in the high street as you might expect. Instead, we enter a narrow alleyway that cuts through the middle of the building to a courtyard beyond. The wooden archway entrance, carved from ancient blackened timbers, tells tales of horse-drawn coaches dropping off road-weary travellers looking for sleep and sustenance. But just beyond the passage, even more ancient history lies beneath. The courtyard leads to the Lion Walk shopping precinct, which was built in the 1970s. Prior to this build, extensive archaeological excavations took place, uncovering all sorts of hidden treasures, including parts of 2 Roman mosaic floors and other Roman artefacts, a military buckle, a wooden bed, even some figs. All of them burnt, damage sustained during the Boudiccan Revolt. But we must put aside this detour into history and get back to the courtyard and the 17th century and the murder of one Alice Catherine Miller in the year 1638. In the 2011 episode of the Great British Ghosts TV series, a local historian tells the tale of a young chambermaid who, being fair of face, caught the attention of a gentleman guest of some importance, possibly a magistrate, and the resulting affair that left Alice hoping for the chance of a better life on the arm of a gentleman. However, her hopes were dashed upon the man's next visit when he made it clear he considered her nothing more than a passing fancy. Between her confusion and disappointment and his rebuttals, somehow the situation escalated to a physical fight, and the young woman was brutally beaten to death. So the story goes, this version of the story anyway, the man made a sloppy attempt to cover up his cold-blooded murder by flinging poor Alice out of the window in a feigned suicide, her broken body landing in the courtyard below. But that was certainly not the last to be heard of Alice Catherine Miller at the Red Lion Hotel.
To this day, hotel guests report hearing odd noises and footsteps, being touched by an invisible hand, or spoken to by someone they can't see. People find things to have inexplicably been moved, even visitors sitting down to a meal in the restaurant, and sometimes these mysterious moving objects are quite dramatic. One evening, a night watchman passed through the restaurant whilst going about his normal patrol. However, when he arrived back at the restaurant a few minutes later, he found all the cushions from the sofas stacked up neatly in a pile, one on top of the other. One possible explanation for there being so much activity in the restaurant area is the theory that Alice's old bedroom was in a small attic space above this room. The space is no longer accessible, however, and it seems that Alice has come downstairs to play. This is by no means the only area that she frequents, though. One fairly contemporary report from a witness to an apparition supposed to be Alice herself comes from a previous assistant manager of the hotel. Staying in the hotel overnight, they awoke at around 3 a.m. to see a rocking chair at the end of the bed slowly start to rock. Rather spooked, they watched in amazement as a wispy white shape began to form into a woman sitting in the chair, rocking back and forth. In shock, the assistant manager gasped, and the apparition, apparently concerned for their well-being, worriedly asked, "Are you all right?" Despite not being in the slightest bit all right, and perhaps out of fear, or perhaps out of sheer habitual Britishness, the witness managed to shakily confirm that yes, they were all right, thank you. At this, the spirit seemed satisfied and, with a nod, dissipated to nothing in the darkened room, leaving only the rocking chair gently rocking by itself.
Some other reports featured on the Great British Ghost episode are almost certainly contenders for the creepiest things children say. One mother staying at the hotel grew concerned when her son went suddenly quiet in the middle of some typically noisy play. When asked what was wrong, the boy replied, "The grey lady asked me to be quiet." Another woman had to cover her child's eyes whenever they passed the reception area, as whatever the boy could see there made him cry. One night, the mother awoke in the night to hear her child laughing. She asked him, "What are you doing?" He replied, "Playing peep-bo with the lady." Needless to say, the pair slept with the light on for the rest of the night. Alice is not the only resident ghost, though, and other frequent ghostly visitors include a young boy and the absolute classic, a hooded monk. The apparition of a young boy can be seen running through the Parliament room. Mostly he appears to children, so perhaps he's just looking for someone to play with him. And no traditional haunting would be complete without a hooded monk ghost. And the ghostly monk of the Red Lion appears as a dark, shadowy figure who can be seen lurking in a corner of the reception area, which sounds a tad on the sinister side, but his backstory is supposedly anything but. According to legend, the apparition is the lingering spirit of a monk who heroically ran into the Red Lion during a fire, risking his life in the blaze to rescue a group of children who were trapped inside. By all accounts, he managed to rescue the children, but suffered a tragic end himself when the inferno took his life.
Despite these other well-known entities, however, it seems that Alice is the most active spirit of all, or at least the one who gets blamed for the most activity. Some bedrooms are so active that they're known as the haunted rooms, although accounts vary as to which rooms these are, but the numbers most often given are 5, 6, 7 and 10, and reports include people having their feet grabbed whilst in bed and feeling the bed violently shaking. And these are huge, heavy wooden beds, so it would take a lot to make them move. It must be said that the notoriety of the hauntings in the Red Lion is not something that's only come about with the recent popularity of the haunted hotel experience. The ghostly sightings at the hotel go back a long, long way, and it wasn't always thought of as a tourist attraction. Apparently, there was once a ban on staff talking about the ghosts of the Red Lion for fear of putting off potential guests. In fact, it's said that for 200 years there was an instant dismissal rule in place for any staff caught talking about the hauntings. And the most haunted room of the hotel, whichever that room was at the time, was locked up and left barricaded shut for years. Wesley H. Downes records in his book The Haunted Colchester Area that in 1972, during renovation works, builders stumbled across a sealed-off section of the building. It's not hard to imagine why many people believe this to be the legendary haunted room.
Before I visited Colchester, I was aware that this hotel was quite famous for being haunted, but I didn't realise to what extent. Normally, I can quite easily find information on the history of the places that were visited. The difficulty is usually in tracking down the ghosts. But with the Red Lion, the problem was reversed. However hard I tried to find out more about the history of the place, all I could find was page after page about the ghosts of the building. It's an odd problem to come across, But it seems that after 200 years of trying to keep the haunting under wraps, Alice Catherine Miller is now making up for lost time with her notoriety, and the other history of the building lies firmly in the shadow of her story. Well, the Red Lion might have the most famous ghost story in Colchester, but there were other, lesser-known tales for us to track down. So we headed off to our next destination and got horribly lost. And to be honest, I've got the worst sense of direction ever. And between that and the sometimes sketchy directions of our guide pamphlet, it's a wonder we'd even made it this far on target. We had a pretty good workout up and down the streets of Colchester before we found our destination. I think we were just expecting something more obvious. And with a name like St. Botolph's Priory, perhaps you could be forgiven in looking for something that announced itself rather more grandly. As it was, after retracing our steps for about the third time, we finally found an entrance to the Priory tucked away in a back alley. But what a hidden gem it was when we eventually found it. The best kind of splendid ruins a hopeless Gothic romantic like myself can hope to come across. Founded in the year 1100, the Priory of St. Julian and St. Botolph was the first Augustinian priory in England. Most of the early Norman building was constructed with flint rubble and limestone, but even here you could see evidence of reclaimed Roman brick being worked into the architecture. As with so many of our abbeys and priories, St. Botolph's was dissolved in 1536, although the church remained in use for years afterwards, until the Civil War came to Colchester, and the church was all but destroyed by cannon fire. Nestled in an oasis of green, so secluded from the busy city centre that you'd never guess that the bustling streets of Colchester are a mere stone's throw away. Behind a towering series of archways, the ground rises and slopes up to meet a graveyard, the old weathered headstones starting to topple over, bowing towards the priory, slowly sinking under the weight of centuries. The priory is in ruins now, but enough of the bare-bones skeleton remains to give a sense of its original grandeur. Enough of the doorways and sections of walls still exist to give a tracery of the priory that once was. And as you pick your way through the shades of aisles and corridors, it feels like you're exploring the nooks and crannies of the place, even though they're open to the elements above. Crumbling columns still stand proud, and dislocated windows and doorways arc up towards the sky in defiance of the ravages of time. It almost feels as though the site is haunted by the ghost of the building itself. But that's not the ghost we've really come here for. Despite having the appearance of a classically haunted ruin, the priory is far from desolate or deserted. During our visit, the site is bright and sunny and full of families picnicking and children playing. And on just such a day back in 1993, a young local girl was playing in the priory with her friends. With so many exciting places to explore, it must have made a fantastic playground. But the child's games came to an abrupt end when she came upon a dark, shadowy figure standing next to a tombstone, watching her. This could have been a terrifying encounter, but instead the figure smiled at her benignly. The reassurance didn't last long, however, as the figure then proceeded to vanish right before the girl's eyes. The priory brought us almost to the end of our tour, and by now our legs were growing quite weary. But we had one more place to visit, and it took us back very nearly to the place at which we started. So, leaving the ruins of St. Botolph's behind us, we headed once more towards the castle.
Although all the different walking tours of Colchester vary in their routes, the most logical place for visitors to begin and end is of course at the Tourist Information Centre, where you can pick up a map, postcards and memorabilia. Just back from the busy main street that runs in front of Castle Park, an ornate wrought iron gate opens onto a pretty garden and the front of a large Georgian townhouse. This is Hollytree's Museum. Located in Castle Park and almost sitting in the shadow of the imposing castle, the gardens are a surprising oasis of manicured lawns and borders. The kind of place you could imagine an 18th century lady promenading about to while away a pleasant summer afternoon. At the back of the house is a small but well-stocked tourist information centre, and upstairs is a free-to-enter museum filled with examples of domestic life and childhood in Colchester over the last 300 years. It includes clothes, toys, a collection of clocks by Colchester's famous 18th century clockmakers, and the resident ghost.
The museum is spread over several rooms and floors, with a labyrinthine display of toys that funnels you through narrow corridors of display cabinets containing all manner of staring dolls, punctuated, somewhat inexplicably, by mirrors, creating the situation where, beating a hasty retreat from the cold gaze of many dolls' eyes, I stumble into my own reflection and give myself quite the scare. It's not meant to be creepy, of course, and most people will find it fascinating and maybe even nostalgic. I just really don't like dolls. So imagine my reaction when I come across an entire room of dolls' houses, all fully furnished and teeming with teeny tiny little dolls, their pale faces grinning out at me through the glass. If you've watched as many horror films as I have, you probably won't enjoy this room either. Now, I don't mean to do the museum a disservice at all. It's a wonderful place, absolutely packed with fascinating displays and information, and of course the toy collections make it great for kids as well. It has the added bonus of still very much having the feel of a Georgian townhouse, despite its current incarnation as a museum. And those of you with a wistful, wandering imagination like mine will have no trouble envisaging the smart 18th century house it once was, especially standing at the windows on the upper floors, gazing out across the gardens, as the residents of this house must surely have done hundreds of years ago. And just maybe, one of those previous residents can still be found perambulating the corridors.
For many years, guests have reported the presence of a classic woman in white apparition, with many people experiencing a strange presence, or the chill of something watching them as they stand in front of one particular portrait on the first floor. The portrait is a late 18th century painting of one Miss Ann Lisle, and because of the picture's association with the spooky encounters, many people believe the White Lady to be the spirit of the subject of this painting. For myself, I'm not convinced. The portrait has the very brief information underneath it that Miss Lisle's brother was a well-known Colchester apothecary. But other than that, we don't seem to know a whole lot about the lady. And as far as I could find, she never lived at Hollytree's. This all makes me wonder whether the activity is more related to the position of where the portrait is hung, rather than the painting itself. But we'll probably never really know. Interestingly, the same White Lady apparition is believed to haunt a building called East Lodge, which stands just a few yards away from the museum. Only in this building, the apparition is accompanied by the strong scent of an old-fashioned floral perfume. No one seems to know why it's thought to be the same ghost, though I think those details may, unfortunately, have been lost over time. Other spooky experiences reported at Hollytree's include the sound of beautiful piano music, despite there being no such instrument on the property, and the sound of disembodied running footsteps.
On one of the landings, tucked away in a recess, we find the supposedly haunted portrait of Miss Ann Lisle. It doesn't give me much of a vibe, except that it's not a particularly flattering portrait. The head seems wildly out of proportion with the body, making it seem almost caricature-like. And you could be forgiven for thinking that Miss Anne's beady black eyes were following you around the room. Spooky dolls and beady-eyed portraits aside, though, in the main, the museum had a pleasant, light and airy feel to it. But this was about to change. And as we walked into the room which housed the Colchester's clockmaker's collection, the atmosphere hit us like a brick wall. I was with my intrepid mum and my brother at the time, and they both remarked upon how the room felt different, heavy, almost oppressively so. In my mum's words, referring to her self-declared infamous ability to not sense any spooky vibe in any situation. "If even I can feel it," she said, "it must be bad." I couldn't find any good reason for it. There wasn't anything terribly unusual about the room. It was lined with tall grandfather-style clocks, and if I was playing devil's advocate, I could argue that the combination of tall, linear angles and a slightly uneven Georgian floor could contribute to a funhouse effect and make you feel a bit queasy. But I was sure there was more to it than that. There was a frisson of electricity in the air, and it was rapidly giving me a headache. I had to retreat to the not very comforting safety of the doll's house room to have a quick breather from the overwhelming atmosphere. After a quick break, I tried again, thinking that this time, being more familiar with the room, I wouldn't find it so stifling. But it really was just as bad, actually making me feel quite ill this time. Standing outside, on the threshold of the doorway, my hand started reaching for my phone to take some pictures, whilst mentally I was framing a good shot in my mind's eye. In these few seconds of standing still and looking into the room, a blaze of blue and white light shot out from one side of the cabinets to the right of the room and curved a large arc through the air to the left and down before disappearing without a trace. Dumbfounded, I brought my camera up to eye level, a beat too late, of course. The small room was empty at the time, and unfortunately, I was the only one looking in that direction. Obviously, I went straight into the room to look for an explanation, but to be honest, I couldn't even imagine what could have explained that. It was like a little firework, and I saw this with my naked eye, not through my camera, and not reflected in the glass of the cabinets. This was free flying through mid-air, and I had no explanation for it. Despite this, I did take some pictures, and I got my brother to walk around the room while I filmed to see if it would create any weird dust-light reflecting anomalous effects that I hadn't thought of. But we didn't come up with anything, and even after I deliberately stomped around, I couldn't kick up dust from the floor or artifacts, or move anything in such a way that it might cast weird reflections somehow into mid-air. It was weird, and I've never seen anything like it before. And that very nearly brings us to the end of our tour of haunted Colchester. But wait, I hear you cry, all that stuff about Romans in part 1, and you're telling me there are no Roman ghosts? Fear not, my friends. Good old Wesley H. Downes came up trumps for us again with his book, The Haunted Colchester Area, with, quite surprisingly really, the only Roman ghost story we could find.
We're not sure quite whereabouts in Colchester this took place, except that it was a rural setting sometime in the late 1880s, back in the days when farmers employed children to scare birds from their crop fields. On a hot summer's day, one young lad in this employ found himself some shade under a tree and, understandably, nodded off. He was soon startled awake again by the sound of heavy feet marching up the lane behind the hedge. Wondering what on earth was going on, he rushed to the gate and was met by the sight of hundreds of soldiers in peculiar uniforms with swords and helmets, marching along in columns with standard bearers between each section. The boy watched for some time, until eventually the soldiers disappeared down the dusty lane. Terribly excited by what he'd witnessed, he couldn't wait to rush home and find out what the men dressed as Roman soldiers were doing, marching past his field. but nobody else had seen any Roman soldiers. And what's more, nobody believed him. Except for one schoolmaster who knew a bit about Romans and thought it likely that the lane in question may once have been on a marching route to London, and wondered if the boy hadn't just seen the ghosts of the legendary missing Ninth Legion. Despite the fact that many historians now believe that the fate of the Roman Ninth Legion is actually not a mystery at all, these phantom Roman soldiers remain just as mysterious as ever. Apparently, this story was retold by the witness's great-grandson, who related that his great-grandfather's story never wavered, and that he swore he truly did see the phantom Roman army.
And I'm afraid that really does bring us to the end of this paranormal postcard, and indeed this episode. Just a quick note about the Holly Trees Museum. I believe it has been paranormally investigated, so if anybody's been there, I would love you to let me know what you thought about the room with the clocks in, if you'd experienced anything in there, or if you've ever seen anything like the weird fireworky light anomaly that I saw, because it was strange, and I'd love to hear from you guys if you've seen anything similar. Thank you so much to everyone who kindly shared their stories with us today, and thank you to all of our listeners for being the best listeners in the world.
Apologies again for the delay in the release, and we are working on getting the next episode out as soon as we can. Thank you to everyone that's gotten in touch to give us your support and share your paranormal stories. And remember that if you've had a paranormal experience, we would love to hear about it. So head on over to our website at notonceforyes.com where you can submit your story. Also feel free to drop us a line on social media for a chat, and you can also find links to all of our social media channels on the website.
Take care out there, guys, and we hope you'll join us next episode.
EVP